Thanks for stopping by the Zoom portion of the SRI lectures. This is One Tiny Drops presentation, and we'll be talking about psychological states that are triggered by stimulus related to climate change. The model that we're going to be using for the 45-minute discussion and presentation is this model right here that I put together a schema as a quick way to deliver concepts in a way that are unifying. They all are in an ecosystem of defense system, and how under certain conditions we respond to threat in ways that are counterproductive towards our survival, especially in climate change. So just a quick overview on this. We'll be talking in this 45 minutes. We'll be talking this whole concept of a basic sanity and how basic sanity is different than ego. And we'll see how when the ego, and it's represented as a curtain here, when it ascends high enough to obscure our basic sanity and our joy, it would trigger confusion to flow into these two tanks. And this is an analogous model that I'll be using. And these two tanks are fear and hope. And these two tanks act as also as weights. As they get heavier, they pull the ego, the curtain of ego, further up so as to obscure the basic sanity. And that is the part that we manage our equanimity, but we do it in a way that is counterproductive to our survivability. The bottom half of this schematic will talk about how can we get into a place where we will respond to climate change, and changing the way our relationship to fear and changing our relationship to hope. And from here you could see that the tank that gets filled up also flows into this tank where we relate to our neurosis as manageable work towards connecting us towards the intelligence that's behind fear, and also the intelligence of why we use hope as a way to avoid challenging places within us. So here is the schema as a model of communication, how the mind works with different stimulus and states. The schema right here is represented by this mechanical analogy. And again, this is not an accurate model, but it's a tool to organize our thinking so as to connect the relationships between all these pieces and to understand it's in an ecosystem, a dynamic ecosystem where one part affects the other part in an unseen way. So for today's presentation, I want to break it down to where there are two halves to the schema. The first half is called equanimity, and it impacts you at a local level. And this is how we manage our equanimity in a way where our defense strategy divorces us from the web of life. And the second half is called harmony, and it's a global, and it's a way how we can get out of this painting ourselves in the corner into a globalized way where it puts us in relationship with the web of life. I just want also to point out that on the sides here are footnotes which are definitions of these terms that I'll be covering in this presentation. On the left here are just additional notes to explain what is ego seeking to enhance itself. I just want to give you a heads up that this analogous model is, again, not an accurate model in terms of all the physics and the mechanics are accurate, but it is an analogy to deliver, to transmit a very esoteric concept into our minds. So let's start with the top half, equanimity. And I'm going to bring us closer in. And the part I want to focus on particularly is this relationship between confusion, basic sanity, and ego. And right here, there's a tank called confusion. And confusion is fueled by ignorance. And let's talk about what's the definition of confusion. In this case, confusion is a false sense of the world so as to secure a sense of a solid, continuous self, to feed the ego with pleasure, and to protect the ego from pain. So this thing is served to maintain the ego. Now, both the actions of feeding the ego with pleasure and protecting it from pain, they are inspired as attempts to make disappear or dispel the construction of ego as untenable. It is a construct that does not have any reality outside of our mind. So what we have here is the ego is represented by this curtain. And the curtain rises up, and this reflects that as the curtain is rising up, the ego is getting stronger and stronger. Let's talk about basic sanity. And in this case, basic sanity is nothing more than a greater sanity beyond the ego, retaining self-respect in dealing with things. So, in the tradition of the Tibetan Buddhist psychology, they propose that we have a sense of something that is much more stable, can clearly see, and do not have to require neurosis to experience the world. And that is basic sanity. And the outside of basic sanity is expressed as joy. And joy in this case is the ultimate and a fundamental sense of freedom, a sense of humor, and the ability to see the ironic game of ego, where it uses or it plays with polarities. Everything is right or everything is wrong. There's nothing gray in between. So there exists this state right here. And when the ego gets solid or it gets strengthened enough, the curtain of ego rises where it obscures or it blocks our basic sanity. And as you can see from this curtain rod, when it reaches this particular valve, and these are valves where there's an open state, when it hits past that valve, it opens up the pipeline of confusion that feeds into the tank of fear and the tank of hope. So confusion is this tank that flows, and then that valve opens up when our ego gets high enough, and we have an aggravated sense of confusion so as to serve the ego. So let's take on the left side where we have fear. And here, fear is fearing our own pain, which drives us into the obsessive concerns with ego's desperate needs. And again, the ego is so fragile, is so toppable, that it knows it desperately tries to maintain itself, and it uses fear. And we fear our own pain. We become allergic to our own fears. So, as you can see, when the ego reaches a certain point, confusion starts to flow into fear, the tank of fear. And if it flows high enough, we reach a point of paralysis where we disconnect with our fears. And this is what climate change does. When we see the calamities, or we read it in the news, or should I say the news feels that it needs to protect us from reaching to this place of paralysis. And also it does not make good news. However, when the tank of fear is drained low enough, it reaches a state of fearlessness. And fearlessness is not the absence of the primary fear. It's actually the reduction of our fearful response to fear, which is our secondary fear. We can still experience primary fear, and yet we can have a diminished secondary fear. We embrace fear. We see the intelligence in fear and what it's steering us to correct our ways. So this tank of fear also has a valve, and it gets emptied out through this exit pipe. And this valve is connected to this tank. And this will be the second half of this presentation. On the other side, let's go to the other side of ego. As you can see, the tank of fear is connected to the rod, the curtain rod of ego. And similarly, we have a symmetrical setup for hope. And with hope, it's nothing more than we are hoping for salvation from outside, whether it could be technology, whether it could be the next generation, whether it could be as esoteric and like aliens. But what it does is that it immerses us into an enchanted version of reality. And it puts us into an infantile dependency on a force outside of ourselves. So similarly with the fear tank, the hope tank, if it fills up all the way or gets to a certain point, it leads to cowardice, or some people would prefer the word meekness. And we basically do not have, you could say, the guts to face the truth. The opposite, if when the tank of hope is reduced, it gives us courage. It makes us act in spite of fear. It makes us act in spite of the odds. It makes us act in spite of the alarm that is ringing inside of us. So similarly with the fear tank, there is a valve that's connected to the bottom tank. And when we drain it out enough, not only we return to the state of courage, but this tank is light enough that the ego starts to subside. So the schema is pointing to when we reduce fear by emptying it out, and when we reduce hope by emptying it out, our ego drops, or the curtain of ego drops. We can experience our basic sanity and joy much more. And that closes the valve that is with this curtain rod going lower than these valves. We close the valves to confusion. And we don't get into a place of bewilderment. We are in connection with our basic sanity and our basic joy. So I just want to quickly summarize the relationships in this half of the schema where our equanimity, we have defense strategies to protect our equanimity in a local way. There is this basic sanity that is expressed through joy, a sense of ultimate and fundamental freedom. We have an ego, which is a, you could say, construct, where that ego construct is a paranoid form of insurance. And with that, we have the tanks of hope and fear that when it gets filled up with confusion, it raises the curtain of ego. And the ego obscures our basic sanity and joy. Also want to bring your attention to spiritual materialism. And spiritual materialism, defined here, is nothing more than a continuation of confusion using spiritual or higher transcendental practices and ideas to maintain the same confusion to the point of seeming to be unconfused. And as you can see with certain politics, where the vitriol of partisanship, both parties are dead certain that their position is unconfused. That is what this is pointing to, where we are so confused to the point where we feel we are unconfused. So it's interesting because in ego, the way it manifests itself is that it's in these 8, you could see, I get pleats in this curtain. And this pleats is that in spiritual materialism, the ego seeks higher, loftier positions, higher, loftier ideas, higher, loftier aspirations. Ambition is one of them. Something more spiritual, that's the next one. The next one is more transcendental versions of knowledge. Religion, dogma especially. Virtue, and it could be in the way of virtual signaling, innocence, as a way to maintain the ego. Another one is judgment, always passing judgments, evaluating the world through the filter of judgments. Is this against me? Is this for me? Or am I neutral about it? Another one is comfort. And as you know, comfort is one of the meta needs that is practiced through capitalism. And also it's the hallmark of capitalism. And this is a catch-all, whatever ego is seeking. So let's move on to the second half, which is the bottom half. I'm going to bring you to this point right now. So there's this tank right here. And this tank receives the outflow from both fear and hope. And just to repeat again, when we have an absence of secondary fear, and also when we experience hopelessness, our ego comes down. But we can only experience an absence of secondary fear and a sense of sense of hopelessness when this tank can receive the water and drain out these two. So the bottom tank is interesting. Here, as you can see, when the tank gets filled enough, there's two outflows, and it goes back into confusion. In other words, it gets recycled to its original place, which is confusion. So it's critical that these tanks get filled up and that they become heavy enough so that, as you can see, the tank is connected to the valves that open up fear and open up hope. So as these two valves open up, it receives the outflow. However, there are a couple of things that get in the way with the tank receiving the outflow, which makes it heavy enough to open up the tank of fear and tank of hope. And there are two balloons, air balloons in here. The first one is we're allergic to ourselves. And this right here is we approach ourselves with dread and a fundamental sense of fear. So this is the setup that causes us to have that secondary set of fear. We fear fear, and as a result, this balloon gets big enough that it occupies all this volume, or at least this portion, the volume of this tank, and there's not much of the outflow from the tank of fear and not much from the outflow of tank of hope can make it and accumulate in this larger tank without having to spill back into confusion. So the inspiration behind this allergic sense of ourselves is to cover up our sense of insufficiencies. The next one is, it's this air balloon, is to cover up, or is to allow us to avoid challenging situations, to open us up, to break the sense of form that we're in. So similarly as with this side, on this side there's another balloon of the same construction, an air balloon, and it's called arrogance and egotism. So arrogance and egotism also are inspired to cover up that our sense of vulnerability. This is ironic because we are vulnerable. We are in relationship to the web of life, but the ego does not want to know that. So what it does is that it pumps us up with arrogance and egotism to cover up vulnerability. The next thing is meekness, is to cover up our meekness so that we do not feel a sense of culpability, guilt, or regret. And lastly, it covers up a lack of faith. And that lack of faith is our ability to work with ourselves so as to minimize or at least work to avert greater catastrophe, starting with our own neurosis. So there's certain I want to see right here. We have some notes here. I want to make sure that we cover the notes. So the ideal right here is, how do we deflate the balloon of allergic to ourselves and the balloon of arrogance and egotism? This is where I put in a valve that leaks out. And this valve, when it lowers the stem, when it lowers down, it allows the air to go through this opening and to come out through these L-shaped exits. So what we have here, before I move on, is, so we suffer immaturity when we are allergic to ourselves and when we are pumped with arrogance and egotism. But looking at immaturity and all these dotted inspirations, immaturity is also a reflection of we're covering up our insufficiencies. We're covering up our need to avoid challenging situations. We're covering up our inability to accept we're vulnerable. We're covering up our meekness, and we're covering up a lack of faith. So going back to here, we can see the stem that deflates this balloon. This is a weight right here. And the two antidotes towards restoring us back to a global sense of connection with the web of life is by turning inwards. And turning inwards is nothing more than knowing how to relate to our neurosis. And in the notes right here, turning inwards is one way we do it is we overcome a feeble sense of ourselves, where we use secrecy and privacy to avert looking at parts of ourselves that is out of step with reality. So we get upset when somebody shares a secret that we wear our left shoe on our right shoe, for instance. And when the secret is made public, we get upset with that person. But that is because we are unable to accept that aspect of ourselves. So when we overcome that feeble renunciation with grand renunciation, we can get into giving up our neurotic crimes. So with feeble renunciation, we're willing to do the time when we're caught, but we're not willing to give up the crime, which is in our mind. So neurosis, that's another term. Neurosis in number 5 is simply the inability to face the truth. So by turning inwards, we start to face the truth. We start to work with our neurosis as the two faces of neurosis, where one side deflects away from reality and the other side has reality waiting for us to embrace. So the other weight that empties out arrogance and egotism is faith. And faith is nothing more than believing or having faith that we can regard all psychological and emotional states as workable and salvageable. So I remember I used to do Tao presentations, and one of them was called the Tao of Anxiety. And the way we suffer through anxiety is not because of the primary anxiety. We suffer because we cannot accept we are anxious in nature or by nature. And as a result, we hold on to an image of ourselves where we cannot be riddled with anxiety, or else we are not, quote unquote, a fit member of society and with esteemed standing in society. So these are the qualities of the schema where, if I could recapitulate, where we have the first half is where we have a defense strategy in maintaining our equanimity. But in doing so, our ego rises up, our confusion flows into fear and hope. They never get emptied out. We get into problems because we suffer from paralysis. We run into problems where we suffer from meekness or cowardice. Our ego has taken over. It wants to consume. It wants to obtain. It has aggression and passion and pride in obtaining all these. And confusion is just flowing. It's the lifeblood of this ecosystem of equanimity. So on the bottom half is where we can work in emptying out the tank of fear so that we're not in paralysis. We can empty out the tank of hope so that we're not in cowardice. But there are pre-existing balloons that causes us problems to work with that. We cannot overcome our neurosis by working with all the states that we are in. As a result, these preconditions, these air balloons need to be deflated. And that means we have to turn inwards, where we overcome our feeble sense of ourselves, and also to work with our knowing how to relate to our neurosis, which is nothing more than our inability to face the truth. And finally, having faith that everything we experience is very powerful. Actually, to me, the new state of self-empowerment is to cough up your furball and to look at it, rather than in this place of hope where we feel that self-empowerment is put into us from an external source, or it is something that we have to raise in us and conjure up in us. It's actually in the furball of our own limitations, our own vulnerability, meekness, lack of faith, our insufficiencies, and our need to avoid challenging situations. So the mantra for me with faith is feel more and deeply. And I think this is where the somatic psychologies really help as to we can go in and overcome the barriers of allergy and overcome the arrogance and egotism. So let's pull back and do a quick recap on all this. So we have confusion that's always waiting for us. We have the ego that gets fed by confusion. We have fear and hope as ways to maintain ego and its agenda. But that locks us into this death trap where we cannot act on the climate. And with this bottom half, we can return to a place of harmony and really globalize our sense of equanimity so that we are part of the web of life. But there are two preconditions that affect us from ever getting there, which is one of them is we're allergic to ourselves, and the other is we suffer from arrogance and egotism, so as to hide these states that will be disruptive to our very fragile ego. And the way we do it is that we have to turn inwards, and that is knowing how to relate to our neurosis. And also by having faith that everything we experience, there is a flip side to it. There's an intelligent side to it. And it's workable and salvageable. So this whole model, connecting confusion to the ego, to these two weights, is the more we put weights down here, the more this tank can receive, the more it can empty out fear and hope. The lower the ego becomes, the greater we experience sanity and joy, the more we can cut the flow of confusion that is born from ignorance. Thank you very much for following the logic or explanation all the way through. If you have any questions, please free to contact me, and I appreciate your attendance to this presentation.